Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about photography's use in advertising. When we think about advertising and the history of advertising, it actually has gone uh, quite far back. Here's a fragment. It's of an ad about in Thebes. It's about 3,000 years old, and this ad basically says, having escaped the slave Shem from his master Hapu the weaver, this one invites all the good citizens of Thebes to find him. He's a Hittite, 5 foot high, of healthy complexion and brown eyes, who returns him to the store of Hapu, Hapu the weaver, where are woven the most beautiful fabrics to the pleasure of each one, will be given a piece of gold. So this is sort of like a notice for somebody basically to have their slave returned, but it is also primarily an ad for the merchant himself or herself uh, about the quality of their products. This would probably be an early use of imagery in advertising. Basically, there's a heart. You can sort of see a heart on the bottom center and a foot facing a particular direction, and sort of a face on the right hand side. It's a direction for something. This was in Turkey in the first century, and some people, historians, have speculated that this is basically directions to a brothel. So it's perhaps a first known sex ad, if you will. Here's one that's a little bit later, about between the 10th and the 13th century, and it's an ad for a needle shop around the Song Dynasty. So you can see the use. The first one was just all text, and the second is just images, and this one uses both text and images. Advertising itself boomed in the 19th century, you might say the beginnings of capitalism. And you can see things like this. This is in 1835 by John Orlando Perry, called A London Street Scene. So you can see how public squares are used basically to advertise. Around this time, it's mostly text-based. You can see a couple of things there that use images. But later on in the century, it's still primarily text-based, but a lot shorter, and this time more uses of illustration. Part of this comes from the sophistication of the technology that has been made available at the time, but part of it is as well about the idea of having a culture, people who are encultured to a type of visual communication. And as we spoke about yesterday about the use of popular photography, this sort of visual sophistication was something that um, crept into popular culture, primarily because consumers themselves were allowed to take photographs. So if you look at a typical ad, print ad, this one's from 1925. It's a famous one, actually, called "They laughed when I sat down at the piano, but when I started to play, dot, dot, dot." You can see how long. It's basically a long form text, and the image itself uses up a small portion of the ad up along the top. Here's a close-up of it. The woman's whispering to the man. "Can he really play?" A girl whispered. "Heavens, no," Arthur exclaimed. He never played a note in his life. So basically, it's a line drawing that's used in advertising. That's mostly text. If you trace this use of illustration and text in advertising and how it's gone from this to something that's purely visual like this, where basically the whole layout is dominated by an image with only a few words, in this case 7 words in the headline and 3 words in the tagline. You can sort of speculate, or reasonably so, this transition from text-based way of consuming things, advertising, to something that's more image or even photographically based. the image itself doesn't even have to have any relation to or connection with reality. It can be treated, in this case, as a design element. There's no background. We don't know where she's doing this handstand. The background has been cropped out, and she almost becomes a part of the layout as an abstract element, if you will. Nike selling shoes, we're up to the point even now where you don't even have to show the shoes. It's just basically an attitude. So moving from these type of ads here, a shoe ad where the message is basically the quality of the shoe and the price. We live in a very visual society now where in more ways than one, it really is all about the image that we see and the image that associated with this product and the image that we project ourselves by consuming this product, owning this product, and displaying it to our friends and to the world. So as I said earlier, there's sort of this transition mostly throughout the 20th century in terms of the use of illustration at the beginning to the use of photography the way we see it now in advertising. In fact, photography dominates what we see in terms of illustrations, although now there's just sort of this return to simplified illustrations in some ways. Guinness itself as a company, a beer company, they had these humorous ads for what was a very famous one by John Gilroy, an illustrator, in 1928. There was a whole series of these ads, very humorous, cartoon-like images, to the way Guinness ads are today, using photographic images. A big part of photography isn't just photography itself. Because, they had photographs at the early part of the 20th century. A lot of it actually has to do with color. The Panzani ad that Bart criticizes in one of the essays that we read at the very beginning has its power primarily not because of the fact that what you see in front of you here is a photograph, but that it's a color photograph. If we saw this in black and white, which was a technology that they had in their, even in the 19th century, this is basically what you would get. It's not very appetizing. You don't have the red of the tomato and so on. So you can imagine that this is not necessarily something that people preferred in advertising, primarily because of the technology that's available. In fact, when photography was used at the beginning, it was kind of crude. On the left, you have something that was based on a photograph, a woman sitting down at home, and there's an illustration of her husband on the way to work. And on the right is another advertisement from Coke that is mainly an illustration, and on the lower right there is a photograph. So it's obvious by looking at this that the more appealing ad at the time would be the ad on the right, because it's more colorful. In some ways, it's more sophisticated, even though it's not photorealistic, if you will. You have the same thing here in the 1940s. The photographs have become more prominent, but they're still not as interesting as the illustrations that are used, for example, this one on the right. But you can tell on the left that the photography has become a lot more sophisticated than in the 1930s, for example, where advertising photography was just sort of having a foothold. By the late 40s, you still had the same problem, this issue of, in this case, the coffee brewer itself is a photographic image, and superimposed on it is this illustration of a man. But by the time the 1950s and 60s came, there has been a sophistication in commercial photography. You can tell how how much simpler this is in terms of the use of background compared to this one in the 1930s. You see all the how messy it is with the um, window, what's outside the window, and what's on the table. Photography, in some ways, have this type of the simplicity of the illustration on the right, because partly because a lot of advertising photographers, even up to now, are able to control their environment. So you have something that's more illustrative in some ways, but it's still photorealistic. Compared to this 1945 ad where it's kind of a mix of illustration and photography, and it's not as sophisticated as this previous one I've shown you, which is from the 1950s. Here's another one from the 50s. Again, they're using the type of white background used in a lot of illustrations in the 1930s and the 1920s, but by using more sophisticated photographs. By the 1960s on up, even up to today, advertising photography has obviously come a long way. This is from the 1960s. The dominant, a dominant part of the layout is taken by the photograph. It's beautifully shot, great shadows, great shadow on the right. The lighting is perfect. Of course, by this time, photographers had stylists, they had professional retouchers, color correctors, and so on. So this is the state of advertising and photography and advertising from basically as it developed from the 1920s, John Gilroy, up to the 60s on up. That's it for today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.